Thank you for joining us on Don't Filter Feelings. I'm Lauren Layfield, and on this podcast we have conversations about the issues that matter with people who have stories to share. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, this episode is about suicide. I'm on the set of Hollyoaks with Bryan Kirkwood and Angela Samata, who have both experienced what happens when someone takes their life. So you may find some of this podcast upsetting. Bryan and Angela, welcome to Don't Filter Feelings. Bryan, first of all, I'm going to be on my best behaviour because you're the boss around here, aren't you? What's it like being on the set of the show that you exec produce?
It's very strange being here on camera. It feels very, very weird.
Do you ever get down to the set very often? Because I imagine you're doing really like boss man things.
We do try and make it down as often as we can, but not as often as we'd like.
Yeah, I bet. You've been so busy. There's been so many amazing storylines on Hollyoaks over the past year. And obviously we're here to talk about one that's really important. Before we get into it though, the first question we always ask our guests is, how are you feeling?
Slightly nervous about the podcast. Very excited to be invited to be part of it. It's a subject really close to my heart. But as with anything where you're kind of digging deep in front of an audience, slightly nervous.
It is a little bit, isn't it? Angela, how are you feeling?
Definitely share that. I mean, it is nerve-wracking, isn't it? It's kind of not quite knowing what to expect. And yeah, it's the end of the day and it's been a really busy week so far. So yeah, really looking forward to doing this actually. I think it's such an important topic. It's great to be able to do this.
Oh, we're so happy to be covering it. You, Bryan, have been so responsible for many of the mental health storylines on Hollyoaks. Yeah. Why have they been important for you to portray on screen?
Well, it goes back to my childhood. I grew up in a house that wasn't represented on TV at all. Right. My mum took her own life when I was just a month short of my 8th birthday. Oh my gosh. My dad, who was gay, which was almost unheard of, certainly to my friends and family at the time. This is the early 80s. My dad brought my brother and I up single-handedly for a number of years. But as a result of many kind of traumatic events in his own life, he eventually led to him losing his own fight to addiction about 15 years ago. So mental health dominated and defined my childhood, my whole life, in fact. And as I've said before, I think it wasn't necessarily that mental health killed my parents. I think it was the silence surrounding their mental health, the fact that nobody spoke about it, nobody ever acknowledged it. My mum sort of disappeared. My family was so shocked by the grief that her name was never mentioned again. And I've recently spoken to my very, very well-meaning aunties about it, and they were just doing what they thought was best at the time. Did
you have anything that resembled a kind of normality as far as normal goes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was periods when she was at home and working in a Saturday job, and my brother and I were absolutely loved and adored and, sent to school, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with the picture unless you knew about it.
And when she lost her life, did you have an understanding of what that was and what suicide meant?
No, she disappeared. We were told that she died. We were never told any details around it, and I kind of pieced the jigsaw together myself in the years that followed.
And so how old were you when you kind of got a grasp of what actually happened?
12, 13.
Gosh. So that's quite a long passage of time to not know, and those are very formative years when you're learning a lot about the world, and to not understand quite what had gone on must have been quite traumatic.
But I mean, that's why I'm so obsessed about putting these stories out on the telly, because alongside that, this sounds like a Hollyoaks story, was my dad living the secret life of a gay man, which was a similarly weighted secret in the household. So it brings me back to the job that we do here at Hollyoaks. And I think really simply, if we can help provoke a really uncomfortable conversation in people's living rooms, then I think that can only be a good thing.
And I sort of feel that had you not been at the helm of these things, these storylines might not have made their way so early. Hollyoaks has always been the front runner for storylines like this, doing the things before the other soaps kind of got to them. And I think that as much as we go through really dark things, there has been obviously some good things that have come out of it ultimately.
Yeah, I hope so.
Angela, can we talk about your background as well? Can you tell us what it is that you do right now?
Sure. So I work in the arts, and I became involved in Hollyoaks a little while ago now, wasn't it, Bryan, when I was asked to have some input into this storyline around Scott suicide attempt, right. About Scott's suicide attempt, and have some input into that, and to actually watch those episodes before they were broadcast, just to sense check, just a fresh pair of eyes looking at that episode. And I think I was incredibly impressed by the amount of detail, the amount of research, the way it was written, and that kind of really switched me on to these difficult storylines being covered in that way.
And why were you sort of best placed to be the person to do that?
So about 15 years ago now, I got my dream job in the art world, and it was a job that I'd always wanted, and I got it. And unfortunately, it was the best of times and the worst of times, because in the same month that I got the dream job in the art world, I also unfortunately lost my partner to suicide. And he, it was very, very unexpected. Nobody saw it coming, and we had a 3-year-old and a 13-year-old at the time. So very, very quickly, I think when this happens to you, you realise that you're not the only person that this has ever happened to, because people, once they realise how you've been bereaved and what happened, they start to tell you their story. It can be as simple as being in a supermarket and someone says, I read about you in the paper, and they say, it happened to me. I lost my mum, or I lost my dad, or my brother, or my sister, or my friend. And so I became aware that this huge, enormous traumatic event that had come into our lives was something that was shared by many other people. And the big turning point for me, I think, was that I realised that I had, very similar to you, Bryan, I had an amazing family around me. I had an incredible support system. I had good friends. But essentially, I felt that I needed to speak to other people who had been bereaved in the same way as me, because I didn't understand the landscape that I was trying to navigate.
And it's like a landscape that you're not prepared for, that you never anticipated.
You don't anticipate it. And I think that I had a 3-year-old and a 13-year-old looking at me for answers, and looking at me for the way that I was reacting to this type of bereavement. And I think I was just trying to get it right. I was trying to do what I thought was best. And again, that situation, Bryan, about, do you tell children the truth? Do you tell them, are you protecting them if you don't tell them that that their parent has ended their life? I was very confused by that. My gut reaction told me to tell my children the truth.
Also, you had quite the age gap between your children as well, so that must have been difficult, because if they're both 14, say, it might make it maybe marginally a bit more simple, but with someone so little.
So my 3-year-old at that time didn't know what not coming back was. So it was a very basic conversation with him about the fact that their dad wasn't coming back. And so I sometimes had to have that conversation on a daily basis, because he didn't really understand what the day after tomorrow was, or what next Wednesday was, or whatever. So it was a different conversation to the conversation that I had to have with my 13-year-old, which was obviously a much more honest, yet still age-appropriate conversation. But I thought that my children had just lost enough. What they didn't need to lose was the trust in their remaining parent. And I felt that if I started to lie to them, although it would have been easier for me at that point. I think what you said, Bryan, absolutely. I think we want to protect our children, and sometimes that means not telling them the truth, we think. But actually what I did was tell them the truth, age appropriately, had some really, really difficult conversations where we all cried together, and we were all okay together. But actually what that did was stood me in good stead for the rest of the growing up that they did, because we were on a level playing field, because I told them that I didn't understand, and I told them that I didn't know why, and that was the truth.
Looking back, Bryan, would you have rather been told, do you think? Obviously you were a little bit younger when it happened, but...
I think I would. And but I've got to respect the decisions made at the time. So there's no recriminations in what I'm saying here, but I do think it would have been better in the long run for my brother and I to have been told an age-appropriate version of the truth. Because not knowing, all I can say is that not knowing what happened to my mum, not knowing what was happening to my dad in the present, meant that there was secrecy, and then when there's secrecy, there's lies, and then when there's lies, there's kind of sort of an uncomfortable kind of atmosphere that you might not know, but you can sense. And I think there's that phrase intergenerational trauma, which I've become aware of over the years, which is, when families or parents are hit by gigantic trauma like suicide, it's very easy for that to trickle down through the generations and affect the next generation and beyond. So I think the way to stop that is by having really tough conversations and speaking the whole truth.
What do you think the impact of suicide is?
I think the impact is so far-reaching. I think we used to say that for every suicide, 6 people were impacted, and then it went up to 10. And the most recent research coming out of America is that on average, it's about 135 people are impacted for every suicide, and that can be close family, close friends, the guy that you bought your paper from every morning, the person who served you your lunch in school. It can be everybody who ever came into contact with you can be impacted if you take your life. And so I think we used to focus on this very small group, but actually it's much wider than that. And certainly when you have somebody in the public eye that ends their life, I'm thinking about people like Robin Williams, it can impact on millions of people. So first of all, the scale of the impact, we've now realised it's much, much bigger than we thought. But I think that the emotions that we associate with suicide, feelings of guilt, blame, shame, can really, really eat into a community, whether that's a family or a network of friends or a bunch of colleagues, because everybody thinks that they should have seen it, that everyone else should have seen it. Why didn't I pick up on that?
Or why didn't you pick on that?
Exactly.
Does that happen? Do people think, well, you lived with them, how did you not know?
Absolutely. And I think it's a very dangerous game to play, but I think most people play it. Everybody's got an opinion why. Everybody thinks that everybody leaves a note, and sometimes notes are left. In about 80% of cases they're not, but even when a note is left, it can have been written in anger, it can have been written a long time ago, it can be written that they blame one person, but in their irrational mind at the time, that behaviour could have been completely misinterpreted, So again, I think that the impact for me that I witness can be that you see the very best of people, and strangers want to help you and your family and friends, but you can also see the very worst of people when they are blaming each other and when they are really tearing chunks out of each other because nobody knows the answers.
So in terms of talking about it, obviously we seem to have come on leaps and bounds. We've definitely seen, I think, in the last 2, 3, 4 years, a lot more celebrities coming out and talking about it, and pop stars talking about it, and songs being written about it, which is all amazing stuff. But I think we're still not quite there, are we, Angela? What do you feel about it?
I agree. I think we have come a huge way. I mean, in 15 years, so I've been, because of my experience, I've been working in and around suicide prevention and suicide awareness and bereavement for the past 15 years, alongside my career in the arts. And I think that, things have absolutely moved on. And And there's lots of reasons and changes in society that have brought that about. But I do also feel that we have got a long way to go. We've just had some new data released for people taking their lives. And actually, we were expecting rates to go up, and we know why those rates have gone up. And some of it is around things like when you go to a coroner's court, it used to be that the thing that we call the standard of proof, how you can prove that somebody absolutely intended to end their lives, that was very, very high. It was called the criminal standard of proof, and now that has been lowered. So we knew that we were going to see more conclusions and verdicts of suicide, and that's why it looks like the rates have gone up now. So it's we were expecting that. But I think while we're still looking at around 6,000 people a year ending their life, and 75% of them being men, we've still got work to do.
The men thing seems to be particularly sticky, I think. I know in amongst my friends, the girls are now quite cool about talking about stuff. The boys are all really, really struggling. I'm sure they won't mind me saying, but they've all kind of got different issues going on, and trying to get them just to talk between themselves without me shoving them in each other's direction is an impossibility. And it's why are boys and men so difficult about chatting openly about it? Is it macho culture? Is it...
I think that's got a part to play in it. I think it is, I think it is about, and I feel I'm a woman answering this, It's kind
I will come Bryan next.
but it kind of feels as if it's expectations that society puts on men. It's things like using phrases which I absolutely hate, like man up. It's all of those things that have accumulated into something that we think a man should be like. And we think that we're bringing up men when actually we should be bringing up human beings, And I think we have a different measure of what success looks like for men. We have a different measure for what health looks like for men. We have a different measure for what, working hard looks like for men. And I think while we've got these unrealistic expectations, well, no one can live up to them because, they don't exist. So again, I just think that... I don't know.
Have you ever struggled with having those conversations, Bryan? Obviously, you're being really open with us now, but has it ever been a difficult topic for you?
Well, actually, I was just reflecting on what we were saying there. In that, my husband has a really close-knit gang of male mates. He's really lucky. He's been in the same gang of male friends since he was 5, and I always grew up with girlfriends in a gang of girls, and we've been together for nearly 20 years. But he thinks I'm a giant snowflake because I want to talk about my feelings and and link pinkies and form a caring circle the whole time. And
that's what girls do.
Him and his mates just want to go down the pub and talk about nonsense, quite frankly. Yeah. But it's horrible, and it's a horrible truth that, despite all the amazing work by the Samaritans and by Mind, and the fact you can't walk 6 feet along a railway platform without seeing a brilliantly clever advert for the Samaritans, the fact is, it seems to me that, and I don't have the answer to this, God knows, but I think that something isn't quite there yet with the communication about.
And it must be communication. That must be. I don't think it's an inherent gender problem. I think there's something in the way that groups of men maybe speak to each other. I think are men more inclined to, like you say, go down the pub and what do they require? Is that the $1 million question?
I have to tell you, I've never had a man sit in front of me that didn't want to talk about things. I think sometimes it's about creating the opportunity, but also it's not just, we keep saying to men, you need to talk, and that's fantastic, and they do need to talk, but then we need to go further. We need to create the place to talk. We need to create the way to talk. We need to, I have to say, I've never had a situation where somebody's asked to see me and they've said nothing to me.
So the issue's not talking, really. I don't want to rubbish any campaigns that are out there, but is the issue maybe not talking? It's about getting them to the place in in the first place?
I think it's not either or. I think it is talking, and I think all of the campaigns that are encouraging everybody to talk more, to talk about their feelings more, to, this podcast, don't filter feelings. Absolutely, you can't get any better, But I think we have to do better in creating the places to talk. And again, I think things like showing storylines on television, creating those platforms for discussion are fundamental to that, because sometimes it's easier to talk about a stranger or a fictitious character on Hollyoaks going through a challenging time than it is to, it's like asking for a friend, Have you ever
had someone come in and reference something they've seen on the TV?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when we did I think there's two things. When we did we made a film called Life After Suicide, and I talked about my lived experience on the BBC, and I think the outpouring after that of people just feeling relieved that they could see somebody who was just an ordinary person who was going through what they went through, the impact of that, and allowing people to just say, yeah, this happened to me, and for them to not feel alone was just incredible. Incredible.
And in terms of your partner, just going back to that, you had no idea. No. Then he never let on anything.
No. I think it's a real case of, and you'll probably back me up on this, Bryan, but I think it's a real case for me of I wish I knew then what I know now, because I've had 15 years of having the great privilege of speaking to people who feel suicidal, and for them telling me how it feels to feel suicidal and how it, the place that they're at. And I wish that I'd have known then what I know now. I think that final conversation that I had with Mark would have been very different. It wouldn't have been, I'm on my way home, I'll speak to you when I get there. It would have been, okay, we need to talk about this. We tell me about how you're feeling, because I would have known that the things that were going on in his life could add up to him not feeling great. So that's why we need to do things like this and talk openly and honestly. And I think that being able to do that, hopefully, if someone else is listening to this and they're worried about somebody in their life, it will give them an idea of where they can turn to for help, or how they can have a conversation, or the simple fact that if you ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal, that conversation is more likely to save their life than it is to end their life. Asking somebody directly.
And is it that directness? Is that what we need? I know a lot of talk has been had about not keeping it open, but being really clear and saying, like, how are you? Is everything okay? And really, like, getting to the nub of it.
I think if you ask somebody if they're having dark thoughts, well, your dark thoughts and my dark thoughts are probably really different. Yeah. I think if you say to someone, you're not going to do anything silly, are you? Well, it's not silly. For them, it's a life-changing decision. If you ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal, that is, we all know what we're talking about. So to my mind, I would be encouraging people to ask people directly, but know what to do if the answer's yes.
What if you ask the question though, and you get the response back, which happens so many times, which is, yeah, I'm fine.
Ask it again. Ask it again. Ask it as many times as it takes until you are convinced that the answer is authentic and true. Just keep asking it again.
And do you mean that even if it takes months, even if it takes years?
Yes.
Because often that'll be the response I get back from so many friends is they're fine, they're always fine.
If you're asking the question, they know that you care about them. And if you're asking the question a lot, they know you care about them a lot. I think also to do things like ring Papyrus Helpline, they will advise you. If you're worried about a friend, ring, get some advice. I think that your stomach is an amazing thing. It will tell you if something is wrong. It will tell you if you're worried about a friend, you can feel it in your stomach if something isn't right. I think we spend quite a lot of time not listening to our stomachs. You can feel it. And I think you will never regret asking the questions. Sometimes you regret not asking the questions. So I would always say that we clinically, sometimes we worry that if we have people who are very, very low in mood, and all of a sudden they are very elated, we worry that sometimes it can be because they have made a decision that they are really seriously considering ending their lives. But sometimes it can be that actually if somebody's mood increases very slowly and they are starting feeling better and they're talking to you more and they are, you know, looking at their protective factors more and they're engaging more, it can be actually that they've realised what was the issue and they've addressed it. So, but you will only know that if you ask them questions and if you open those doors of communication.
Can we talk about terminology around suicide? Obviously, for a long time, it's been committed suicide. How do you feel about that, Bryan? How do you feel about that wording?
It's alongside committing a crime, isn't it? Committing a sin.
Yeah.
And so if we separate the language from something criminal, then I think that's a good thing.
That's where it came from. Right?
That's where it came from. Yeah. It's like it's where we get coroner from. The word coroner was because if you attempted to take your life or if you took your life, the coroner came and took all of your wealth away, and so that's where the crowner. That's where we get it from. And again, for me, the language around suicide is really, really important, because I think sometimes we've got to be straight. We've got to call suicide. If somebody feels suicidal, we have to say the word so we all know what we're talking about. But I think when I'm working with families bereaved by suicide, they really appreciate it when you don't say committed suicide or when you try not to say it, because it means that we're really valuing their experience.
What do you think needs to happen going forward? Obviously, we've made loads of progress. We're still not there. So what happens next?
I think if it was me, I would be teaching all of our young people how to recognise their own risk factors. What is it that is their risky behaviour? What is it that they know? It could be drinking, it could be drugs, it could be getting into toxic friendships. What are your risk factors? What is making you not feel great? But I would also ask them to identify their protective factors, and that can be things like going for a run, things that make you feel good. It can be your dog, your cat, it can be your family, it can be going to an art gallery. But what I would do is I would teach young people from a really early age how to recognise their protective factors, what keeps them safe, what makes them feel loved, what makes them feel good. And I would ask them to start recognising what risk factors are. What's the risky behaviour? What's not making you feel good? And how to change those risk factors and move away from them and increase your protective factors. Because I think we have to realise that we have it within ourselves to do that, and actually only us know what our risk and protective factors are. So I think to allow young children to really start thinking about that from a really early age, and our risk and protective factors change throughout our life. But I think if we start thinking about ourselves, what protects us, what makes us feel risky, I think knowing yourself and being able to articulate that is really important, because when we have too much of one and not enough of the other, we can change that balance. We can do it ourselves. So I think being able to do that would be an amazing thing.
From a media point of view then, Bryan, what do you think you want to see more of or make more of?
I don't know. I think the biggest challenge that I'm becoming aware of is how you get this message not just across, but under the skin of the quiet man who has never been able to talk. And brilliant campaigns like Don't Filter Feelings and all the literature and all the noise about mental health over the last couple of years is fantastic. But I guess if that quiet man, it's just noise. How do you make it personal?
But I have to say, I do feel like the work that Hollyoaks is doing is fundamental to that, because we know that 75% of people who end their lives have never reached out to any services. They're not in touch with any agencies or doctors. They haven't told anybody how they feel. I do feel as if that using that mass media as a vehicle to just plant some of those seeds, to see people getting the help that they need, to see how people can reach out and what happens if you don't.
Well, Bryan and Angela, thank you so much for joining us and being so open with your stories and not filtering your feelings. If you want more Don't Filter Feelings, you can search the hashtag or check out Hollyoaks on your social feeds. And if you need any help or advice with anything that you've heard today or seen on Hollyoaks, you can check out channel4.com/support. Or Angela, what would you recommend? Any other websites, places people can go?
Yeah, I think the Hub of Hope is great. You can just download it for free, put your postcode in, it'll tell you what's around you. But also, if you're on the phone to a friend who's in Scotland, they can put their postcode in and find out what's around them. I think Papyrus is amazing as a charity. They have the Hope line that you can ring and just get some advice and support. And I think if if listening to this has kind of made you wonder if a friend is okay, ring them, send them a text, send them a quick Instagram message, just checking in.